On that note, I'd like to follow that. A lot of frustration I hear from local leaders at the state level is that regulations come in a one-size-fits-all box, essentially. For example, EPA clean air regulation. People here say what might work in Florida isn't going to work here in Utah given our, geographic obstacles and whatnot. So by putting it back into the hands of Congress to implement and pass regulations, how can we begin to chip away at that issue?
First of all, I think that is a great example. And if we had to follow this process that we're contemplating where new regulations would have to go through Congress and be passed, that is exactly how we would form the basis for coming up with new provisions of law that would give greater discretion on a regional basis to improve our air quality. And that's this goes to Natalie's question of how do we get bipartisan support for this. None of these ideas are distinctively Republican versus Democratic or distinctively conservative as opposed to liberal. And a lot of these would achieve ends that would be deeply satisfying to people of both political parties. This example is one that illustrates how it could lead to cleaner air in many parts of the country where the one-size-fits-all model doesn't work. And so I think that would be enormously helpful.
Representative Love, you mentioned the fiscal cliff, the 11th hour, pushing everything into one bill. Oftentimes our funding is passed hidden in a bill, 2,000 plus pages long.
Yeah.
You recently introduced the one subject at a time bill. Talk about how this fits into the effort that you're talking about with the Article 1 project.
So funny you bring that up, Glenn. I have to tell you, it's one of those bills that was common sense to me. Utah's legislature, we have that actually written in our Utah state constitution, and it's worked really well. One of the biggest frustrations I've had are all of these pet projects put together with these must-pass bills, and all of a sudden it's a lose-lose situation where you're getting a little bit of what you want and a whole lot of what you don't want. I believe that every single bill has to be held up on its own merits, and people have got to be able to make a decision whether they support one bill or not. The bill that I introduced, it's very simple. It's less than 2 pages. It's every bill enacted by Congress has to be enacted with one subject at a time, and that subject has to clearly be stated in the title. That way we're not depending on big think tanks to make these decisions for us. I'm not waiting for somebody to come in and say, hey, by the way, this bill is bad or this bill isn't bad, and all of a sudden you get a mass of people that say, you know what, so-and-so says it's not good. This allows some transparency. This allows for the public, again, to get involved in legislation. They'll be able to look at it themselves and say, you know what, I support that or I do not support that, and I'm going to call my member of Congress on my own and tell them why I support it and why I don't support it. Everything that I do, everything that my job, I believe, is to try and restore power back to people so that they are involved in the process. I've often said this, if you are not standing up, if you are not authoring your lives, then you run the risk of someone else doing it for you. And this is, I believe, the environment that we have in Washington. We have too many people making decisions for us, and the public is not involved in this. So one subject at a time allows people to be involved in the legislative process. You're not trying to pass 2,000 plus page bills in less than 72 hours and hoping that what is being passed is going to work out for everyone. I think that it's absolutely a subpar way of doing things, and I think we're better than that.
Senator Lee?
I'd like to just echo my support for that effort, and it's an effort I support and one that I intend to be pushing in the Senate. I've come up with a sort of familiar analogy to it because, most people don't think in terms of single subject legislation. It's not something we think about a lot, but put it in these terms. Imagine if you lived in an outlying area, a very remote area, and there's only one grocery store around. It's the only grocery store you have access to because any other store would be hundreds of miles and many, many hours away. And imagine further that shortly after moving to this area, you stop by that grocery store just to buy the basics. You need to buy bread, milk, and eggs. You go into the store, you get out your cart, you put bread and milk and eggs there, and then you get to the checkout counter, you put down your bread and your milk and your eggs, and you get out your wallet, get ready to pay for it. And the cashier says to you, I'm sorry, this is a different kind of store. This is a congressional store. And what does that mean? Well, it means you can't just buy bread, milk, and eggs. You can't buy bread, milk, and eggs unless you also buy a bucket of nails and a half ton of iron ore.
Doritos.
Some Doritos. a book about cowboy poetry, a Barry Manilow album from the late 70s. And for that matter, while we're at it, we want you to buy one of every item in the entire store. And you say, I don't want all of those things. I don't even like Barry Manilow. And the guy says, too bad. Unless you buy all of those items, you can't buy any of these. That's what it's like to work in Congress. That's what it's like when Congress spends. That's what it's like often when Congress legislates even outside the spending sphere. And it's wrong. It leads to all kinds of problems. It results in us not doing things we should do and doing a whole lot of things we shouldn't do.
This is another bill also, by the way, that we have a lot of bipartisan support for. A lot of the bills that there are people on the other side of the aisle that are tired of having to vote for several things that they like and several things that they don't like all at once. They'd rather, because they have to go home and explain why they voted for the thing that nobody wanted them to vote for. So again, now we get to actually vote on those one issue bills. They have to stand on their own, and then you have to go back and explain why you voted for those issues. And I'd rather keep the promises I made without having to compromise any of the other things that I didn't promise. So again, this is a way of adding some transparency and simplifying things a little bit so that things aren't so complicated.
I might add, possibly even voting on things you didn't read because it was 2,000 plus pages wrong or long.
And I'll tell you right now, if somebody can, I know you read like crazy. I won't read any of his books that he recommends to me because that would take my whole life. But I'll tell you, it is incredibly important for your members of Congress to be able to read every piece of legislation and be able to explain every single aspect of that legislation. And I think that it's absolutely irresponsible for us to be able to be handed a 2,000 plus page piece of legislation that you have to try and pass within 24 hours. It's irresponsible, and I think that, again, we're better than that. We can do a better job.
All right, I want to hit on one last.
This happens all the time. It happens several times every year. I assumed when I was first elected that this was a rare event, but it happens several times every year, and it's awful.